Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back at Mary's Woods. I'm Ron Silver, and I have been doing these monthly talks, kind of diversity lectures. And today is really our first look at Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm going to come back in March and during Women's Month and talk more about her. But the talk today is Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The reason why we have this topic is in 2 days, December 10th, it is International Human Rights Day. And that has come about because it was on December 10th, 1948, that the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so that sort of gives some of the setting for what we're doing today. I want to tell you a little bit of personal history for why I sort of embraced this topic. The person in the man on the screen is Jimmy Roosevelt, oldest son of Eleanor Franklin. Jimmy Roosevelt was my congressman for 12 years when I was growing up as a kid in West Los Angeles. And he and my dad actually became very good friends. And so it's sort of fun to delve into Roosevelt history. His mother, Eleanor, you have to know about my dad. He was a doctor, he had a medical office in Hollywood. And in his office, he had lots of gruesome paintings of medical procedures from the Middle Ages. He had lots of corny doctor jokes from medical magazines. And he had the photograph of one woman up in his office. And it was not my mother. The one photograph he had up on the wall in his office was of Eleanor Roosevelt because he just adored her and thought the world of her. And so that was the world I grew up in, the world of Jimmy Roosevelt as my congressman and Eleanor Roosevelt as somebody who was greatly admired in my house. So let's set the stage, and we're going to be kind of weaving in and out of history and the timeline as I tell the story. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights comes out of the United Nations and of a desire to see something different in the world. And what birthed this desire was, of course, the horrors of World War II, but particularly the horrors that were visited upon civilians. And you see these concentration camp survivors. You see this very famous photograph from Nanking in China when the Japanese had rained bombs on that city and engaged in all sorts of cruelties. And this is the photograph from Coventry, England, that had been the victim of the Blitz, where you had this terror bombing campaign on civilians. And so during World War II, you had this process that happens that is going to lead us to the United Nations, and we'll spend more time there about what specifically leads to the Declaration of Human Rights. But this process that leads us to the United Nations, of course, there had been the League of Nations after the First World War, which had become an abject failure, and World War II breaks out. And you see here, the first is a photograph of Churchill and Roosevelt, and you'll see George Marshall behind him, behind Churchill. And this is where they come up with the idea of this Atlanta Charter, which is where they've already, even before the war the United States is not even in the war yet, and yet Roosevelt is meeting with Churchill to start creating a vision for a world after the war, and the idea maybe of another world government. And of course, by Yalta in April of 1945, there you see Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meeting in the Crimea in Yalta, not too far from Sebastopol. And that is where they really do cement the idea of a United Nations. The Soviet Union buys into a United Nations. And I want to go back to the Atlanta Charter, and this is really just for fun, because On the right, and we'll look more in depth at it later, on the right you see sort of the formal Atlantic Charter. On the left you see an early draft with some of Winston Churchill's chicken scratches on it. But the thing that I love about this that is so English is instead of top secret, it is most secret. And what I love is this line where it says, note, this document should not be left lying about, and if it is unnecessary to retain, should be returned. Only the British would refer to a document as not being left lying about. So I just had to, it's wonderful the things you can find on the internet when you search for stuff. And so in June of 1945, when the war is actually still going, the war in the Pacific, leaders from around the world meet in San Francisco, and they create this United Nations. And the United Nations has a charter, I'll get to that in a second. But the American delegation, it's going to have these heavyweights to it. You've got George Marshall, John Foster Dulles, and they're going to have their first meetings are going to be over in Europe in late '45. And Harry Truman has been growing frustrated with Eleanor Roosevelt going around and making speeches in America that he thinks are interfering with him establishing himself and making his own his own mark. And he turns to Jimmy Burns, who is his Secretary of State, and he says, what am I going to do about that? And he says, well, why don't you add her to the delegation and send her off to Europe, get her out of your hair. And so that's how Eleanor Roosevelt ends up with the original United States delegation that goes over to Europe as the United Nations is starting with these other heavyweights. George Marshall, for whom the Marshall Plan is named after he becomes Secretary of State, he was Franklin Roosevelt referred to him during the war as the organizer of victory. He was a 5-star general, but he stayed in America, but he was the brains behind the war effort. John Foster Dulles, for whom Dulles Airport is named. And one of the things I love talking to this audience is, you all know who I'm talking about. I've taken plane loads of kids to Washington, and we land at Dulles Airport, and I start talking about John Foster Dulles, and they think I'm talking about somebody from the 17th century. But of course, John Foster Dulles really was sort of the most important Secretary of State. That was for Eisenhower until Henry Kissinger comes along. He's a giant of American foreign policy. But then there's Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, you see I've got a picture here of Rudolph, because this is the time of year. I've got Christmas on the brain. And the thing is, these men really discounted Eleanor Roosevelt. They weren't happy that she'd been foisted upon them. Nobody asked their opinion. They didn't give her a lot of respect. And she, in the phrase of the holidays, they would not let her play with their reindeer games. But then one foggy night, something happens. There is a Soviet delegate named Andrei Vyshinsky. And Vyshinsky was a fierce debater. And he gets into it one day over in Paris on the issue of what's going to happen with displaced persons. This is really one of the big conundrums after the war is over. You have millions of people who have been displaced by the war. And there's a significant number of them who should theoretically be going back towards the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union satellites. And they don't want to go. And so Vyshinsky is arguing, he gets up and he just gives this blistering argument about how the Russians have to be in control of those camps. They can't be cutting any favors for Quislings and fascists. And nobody should be allowed to go into those camps and try to talk those people out of going back to the Soviet Union. And this is really a human rights issue that Dulles and Marshall and the other male members of the delegation have not spent any time thinking about. They're more worried about how to stop World War III, what they think of as more important issues, and they have nothing to say in response to Wyszynski. And so, at one point, Dulles turns to Eleanor Roosevelt and says, Eleanor, why don't you go up there and talk? And so Eleanor Roosevelt, without any notes, without any preparation, goes up to the dais and just cleans Wyszynski's clock. Again, I told you about what you can read what you can find on the internet. I had heard this story, so then I just put into my Google search engine, Eleanor Roosevelt rebuts Wyszynski. And amazingly enough, I was able to pull up both what Wyszynski said and Roosevelt's extemporaneous response. And she just lays them out. And it's a revelation to these men of what her potential at the United Nations could be. Now, it's a revelation because they've been fairly ignorant, and you're going to see why once we start getting into Eleanor Roosevelt's story. But this is what John Foster Dulles says to, and he probably called her Mrs. Roosevelt. He probably would not have said Eleanor. When she gets back to her seat, John Foster Dulles reportedly says to her, Mrs. Roosevelt, when you were appointed, I thought it was just terrible. But I must say, your work today has just been fine. And so now they let her play in all the reindeer games. They realized she was one of the heavyweights from the United States that was there. So let's take a little time and talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. I apologize for clearing my throat. So this is a photograph from her when she's a young woman. She came from a rich family. She was a Roosevelt, but she was not a lucky one. She was an orphan by the time she was 11. She was farmed out to other family members. She was incredibly shy. She did not like to speak at all. And was living a very, kind of sheltered life, and then gets sent over to Europe. And she actually learns how to speak French in Europe, but she doesn't get much official schooling. Young women in those days, it was entirely possible within even a family like the Roosevelts that, even high school and college was not for a young woman. So she's denied all of that. And she ends up getting married off to her fifth cousin, Franklin. And what she does almost immediately is have a ton of children. She has 6 children in quick order. Sadly, one of them died very soon. So you see here she is with her 5. And this looks like a happy family life, but this photograph is really deceptive. This is the one that gives a more realistic view of her life at that time. Because this one has her mother-in-law in it, Sarah Delano, which is where the Delano comes in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Sarah Delano is in the photograph holding the baby now. And Sarah Delano was the mother-in-law from, and I'll let you fill it in. We would now say she was the original helicopter parent. She hovered over Franklin, and she was a powerful woman. And she threw her weight around, and she threw her money around, and made life for Eleanor fairly miserable. And Eleanor pretty much kowtowed to her all during this phase. And then Eleanor's world gets completely rocked. She discovers accidentally that her husband, Franklin, with whom she's had 6 children, has for years been having a very active affair with his social secretary, Lucy Mercer. And as she's cleaning up the house for a move, this is Eleanor, as she's cleaning up the house for a move, she discovers the love letters, and she confronts Franklin. And she offers Franklin a divorce. But remember I talked about Sarah Delano. Sarah says to her son Franklin, if you divorce that woman, I will cut you off without a penny. And Franklin, who is very ambitious politically, is told by Lewis Howe, his #1 political advisor, if you get a divorce, it will destroy your political career. And so Eleanor and Franklin reach an agreement. The first is that they will henceforth sleep in separate beds and never be physically intimate again. The second is she gets Franklin to promise that he will never be intimate again with Lucy Mercer, which he proceeds to violate, but he says he'll do it. And the third thing that happens is that Eleanor begins to assert her independence from her mother-in-law, and she begins to find her own voice. She finds that place inside herself of empowerment. And she stands by Franklin after he develops polio. And if anybody here has ever seen the movie Sunrise at Camp Ago, which I saw as a kid, great movie. I always thought Ralph Bellamy was Franklin Roosevelt. Well, years later, I figured out they were actually two different people. But that shows how she decided to hitch her wagon to Franklin for the rest of his life and be his political partner. But all during that phase, she is gaining strength. It's like you can see her battery is filling up to 100% all during that time. And when she becomes First Lady of the country after Franklin is elected president, she becomes the ears, the feet, and frankly the heart of Franklin Roosevelt. And these are just a couple of sample photographs I was able to come up with of just, here she is riding down to the coal mines with coal miners in Appalachia, being with poor folks in Puerto Rico during the Depression. And then when the war breaks out, she is literally everywhere. She is indefatigable and unstoppable. You see her visiting with troops, with the wounded, going up for a flight with the Tuskegee Airmen. When she would be on a ship, sailing over to Europe or sailing anywhere in the Pacific, she would always make it a point to get up early so she had mess with the enlisted men, not the officers. So this is how the Eleanor Roosevelt who cleans Wyszynski's cock is created. And so when the United Nations is formed, in its charter, it says that one of the purposes of the United Nations will be to create a world that values human rights. And so the General Assembly decides that one of the things they want to do is create a mechanism for making that real. And so they decide to create a small committee of 18 to explore the idea of drafting a universal declaration of human rights. And Eleanor Roosevelt is chosen to be one of those 18, and the 18 immediately choose her to be their chairman. That's the term they would have used. We would say chairperson now. But she was the chairman of the committee. And they wanted the committee, and so now we're going to switch from really focusing on Eleanor Roosevelt. Now what I'm going to talk about is what were the antecedents to what becomes the Declaration? Where does it come from? What do they look for? And they actually start with the Magna Carta, because it's really the first instance of when power relents and it's established that an individual can have rights against the state. It's not hard to come up with this one. One of the main sources of antecedent documents which talk about rights is the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, certain and inalienable rights. So it's not hard to find them in the Declaration of Independence. It's not hard to find them in the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law affecting the right to exercise freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the due process of law, the Fifth Amendment, the right to be free from searches and seizures in the Fourth Amendment. So the Bill of Rights is another lodestar for this declaration to come. And they look to France, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens that comes out of the French Revolution, where liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood. These are obvious enumerations of rights in documents that governments have accepted. And these are all going to become sources for the Universal Declaration. And then we're going to jump forward over more than 100 years to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. When the United States decides to enter World War I, Woodrow Wilson, in terms of selling it, both primarily to the country and staking a claim to the world, he talks about this is why we're doing this. This is what we intend to accomplish. And he lists 14 points. Georges Clemenceau, who was the leader of France, is reported to have said, "Mon Dieu, God only needed 10, but Wilson needs 14. But most of them just have to do with the war. We're not going to pay attention to it. But look at number 5, adjustment of colonial claims. So when the Western powers prevailed, when the Allies prevailed, and they went to the peace conference at Versailles, this one, number 5, adjustment of colonial claims. It was very inspiring to a young man who came to Versailles to speak to the territorial claims of where he lived. But he was not given the time of day. He was not considered worthy of consideration. That young man is Ho Chi Minh from Vietnam. He was shunned, and his claims for freedom for the Vietnamese from the French were disregarded. So now we're going to fast forward to the Atlantic Charter. And that was that document I referenced earlier, when even before we were in the war, and Roosevelt is saying, why are we getting into this? And he enumerates a few things in that document, in particular, let's see if I've got it. Yes, number 5, securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and Social Security. This comes right out of his experience of the Depression. I mean, literally, Social Security. He's talking about that at the start of World War II. This notion of improved labor standards. Remember, it's really during the Depression that Congress is passing the Wagner Act, creating the National Labor Relations Board, and Roosevelt wants to bring that to the world. And this is a key one. All men may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. Now, we're going to do a little bit of a detour here, because he says they, and they is Churchill and Roosevelt, desire to see no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the people concerned. Remember back to Ho Chi Minh? You know, you would think he's one of those people whose once his expressed wishes considered and what's going to happen with these colonies. But Churchill says, no. Franklin, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just talking about Europe. We are not going to let anything that we're signing here impact the Raj, our experience in India. And here you see on the other photograph this is the British in Kenya, putting down Kenyan freedom fighters. And Churchill's going to look out for his French friends in Indonesia and his Dutch friends in the East Indies, and what becomes Indonesia. And basically Churchill says, no, this is all about Europe. It's not going to be about Asia or Africa. Ho Chi Minh's going to have to wait. But let's get back to the four freedoms, because this becomes the crux, for our purposes, the crux of the Atlanta Charter. And what we have is Roosevelt goes to Congress, and in an address to Congress, he discusses the four freedoms that Norman Rockwell has made all these iconic drawings from. We'll go back to them in a second. But we have the recording of Franklin Roosevelt speaking to Congress, and it's just a joy to hear Roosevelt's voice. So I'm turning it over to Stacy to play it.
The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world.
So hopefully Stacy will get me back to my screen. I have great faith.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm sure you recognize these paintings. They're so iconic here in America. Particularly every Thanksgiving, we see the one with the family with the turkey. But the idea was, Roosevelt is saying, this is what everyone in the world is entitled to experience. This was not an America First concept. This is for the world. And so these four freedoms actually really are a linchpin of the Universal Declaration. So they gather they've gathered in San Francisco. They create this commission to Committee of 18 to draft it. And they decide to put Eleanor in charge because she has staked her claim on human rights issues. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little time talking about, well, okay, that's all great. How did they actually make it happen? And so it happened in Paris. That's probably the name of a movie somewhere. And these are the men and women who are going to put it together. Because as we're going to learn, Eleanor Roosevelt does not play a large role in crafting the words. The only thing that, one thing that we, not only thing, but one thing we can credit her for is she was not a lawyer, she was not a professor, she was not a philosopher, and she dealt in the world of people. And she is going to task all of the philosophers and lawyers and thinkers that are of these 18 to write so that regular people can understand what they write, or understand what they read. And she says to them, we are not going to spend 3 years worrying about where to put a comma. So as you're going to see as we go through this now, this next phase of talking, she's going to be the field general, and I'm going to talk now about the folks who are the actual, the craftspeople. John Peter Humphreys, the man without the beard, and Rene Cassin are considered the principal drafters. Humphrey was an interesting man. He was Canadian, and he had real empathy. He had empathy with people. Like Roosevelt, he too had been made an orphan by the time he was about 10. He had lost an arm in a fire when he was a child, so he only had one arm. And he had become a law professor at McGill University in Quebec, and he was the one who was tasked with gathering all of the possible predecessor documents, predecessor ideas that were going to allow him to create sort of an enumeration of rights. He's not a literary craftsman. He's just he's an enumerator. And it really falls to Humphrey to really sort of put together the first draft, which is just an enumeration of rights. Rene Cassin, who is also another very empathic man, French Jew, a wounded veteran of the First World War, a brilliant legal scholar, but also philosopher and writer. And it falls to him to write the second draft, to take this enumeration and to create sort of an inspiring document from the enumeration. These next three, P.C. Chang, Charles Malick, and Hansa Mehta, all play pivotal roles. Chang is, one of the reasons he's so important is even though both he and Malick, he was from what we would call nationalist China, then just China. Malick, who was from Lebanon. They both had been educated and received their PhDs in America. But they were thinkers. But what was important is that Chang, even though he's educated in the West, he was trained in Confucian thought. And he and Malick in particular kind of go at each other. Malick is, he's a Lebanese Christian, and most of his world has been in sort of negotiating within the different Christian faiths and trying to create harmony between Orthodox, between Protestant, between Catholicism. But it's very much a Christian mindset. Chang is bringing a Confucian Eastern mindset to this, and many times is sort of chiding the drafters of, this is for the world, this isn't just for the West. But they are important, really, they are important players in terms of working with Cassin to create this document that is universal, that's going to live up to its title. And we'll talk a little bit later about one of the criticisms about that. Hansa Mehta is another interesting person in this mix. She's Indian, born and raised in India, goes to England for her extensive education, becomes friends with Mahatma Gandhi, becomes a radical activist in India. She's from the Brahmin caste, but she is a staunch advocate for women's rights. She's going to later play a significant role within the United Nations for women's rights. And she makes one very, very critical contribution that we'll get to in a second. I refer to these women as Eleanor's backup. They were part of, most of them were part of the General Assembly. They were delegates to the General Assembly. And throughout this process from 47 and 48, when they are working on the drafting of the Universal Declaration, they are holding the men's feet to the fire to make sure that it is going to be supporting women's rights, that it's not a declaration for men. Now, we're going to do a little digression. One of the things that was important, one of the real reasons to create this Universal Declaration is we needed to get past, we meaning the Allies, needed to get past the charge of Nuremberg, and these are the original prisoners in the dock in Nuremberg. You can maybe pick out Rudolf Hess, Hermann Goering is in there somewhere. Oh yeah, in the lower corner you see Goering and then Hess next to him. You know, the Nazis claimed that being tried for crimes against humanity was victor's justice. Where were these laws against humanity codified? Where were they written? What do you mean? You know, you won. You're going to kill us. Okay, fine, but don't claim you're doing human rights law. And so that was really one of the goals of this Universal Declaration, is laying down a marker so that henceforth people could be held accountable for laws and rules and standards that in fact the entire world had agreed on. So they were trying to create a framework to avoid victor's justice in the future. It's also worth noting an aside here that it was the winners who were creating these rules. The Germans, the Italians, the Japanese were not part of this process. And it's worth noting what might have been thrown up in the faces of these winners if the losers had been there. And these are just three examples. One is the firebombing of Tokyo, which killed over 100,000 people. The firebombing of Dresden. And particularly, it's important to remember that the United States and Britain adopted a firebombing campaign specifically as a form of terror. This was an attempt to terrorize the civilian population. So that might have been brought up, and the photograph on the far end is of the Soviet soldiers who engaged in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of rapes of German women as they conquered Berlin. So they were, the winners were not willing to look at any of that. So, Eleanor Roosevelt is not the draft person, but she is the person who's going to make it come to life. And I call it the joy of being the chair. There were 85 working sessions in the last 60 days to try to bring this thing to fruition. In addition to those 85 working sessions, she personally held 100 individual meetings with members of the commission and members of the General Assembly to get this thing to fruition. Now, I don't know if you can read this, but one of the objections that came primarily from the Soviet bloc. And remember, the Soviet Union was one of the winners, and they've got a seat on the Security Council. They have a member of the 18, and also remember Belarusia, which is now a semi-independent country, but it then was part of the Soviet bloc. Ukraine, they also have members there. And in this cartoon, you see, actually, this is Professor Malik, who's right in front of her, and you see Wyszynski wearing the dunce cap. And what it says is, I'm going to have to bend down and read it. Eleanor to her class on human rights. Now, children, all together. The rights of the individual are above the rights of the state. Because that was one of the biggest fights she was having with the Soviet bloc, which was the idea that the state comes first. The state, of course, being the workers, which was not true, but that was the Soviet mind. And she had to deal with that. And that was all part of her process of trying to get this thing across the finish line. So, she does. They get a revolutionary document passed by the General Assembly. We'll get to that photograph in a second. But it's a revolutionary document, and I want to talk about some of the things that make it revolutionary. In the preamble, it actually speaks to equal rights for men and women. But then in Article 1, as it was initially drafted, said, all men are created equal, right out of the Declaration of Independence. And Ms. Mehta, who I showed you earlier, she says, no. If you write a document that says all men are created equal, that document will mean all men are created equal. And women will be second place yet again. And so it was Ms. Mehta from India who hammers through the committee and with Rene Cassin to use this revolutionary phrase, a revolutionary phrase. Think about that for a second, but it was that all human beings, meaning men, women, and children, are equal and have rights. Article 2 speaks to all races. Article 13 speaks of freedom of movement and the right to leave a country. Now that's going to freak out. Number 2 and number 13 are going to both freak out South Africa. Because in South Africa, of course, mired in apartheid, all races are not equal. All races do not have freedom of movement. But this notion of the right to leave a country is going to freak out the Soviet bloc. And think back to World War II. Think about every movie you've seen where somebody is at the train station desperately trying to get on the last train to the West. That's what this was trying to say. You've got a right to be on the last train to wherever. In terms of our current world, Article 14 says people have the right to seek asylum. Think of all the Jews that were turned back from our shore during World War II. The SS St. Louis turned back. And now think about now. The refugees being turned back, not being allowed to seek asylum. Well, that's right, Article 14. Here's another one where you can see the Article 16, where the women who worked on this, and Mrs. Roosevelt's backup women, this need for a bride to consent to marriage. Again, a revolutionary idea to apply to the world. And here's one that creates difficulty within the Muslim world. They had no problem with religious freedom, but the right to change religions. there was a concern of trying to move people away from Islam. That becomes a problem. In Articles 22 through 25, where you can, this is easy to find online, where it lays out economic rights. The idea that people have economic rights. This is revolutionary in terms of applying this to the world. So, actually, let's go back. So, Eleanor Roosevelt gets this document through her committee, through 85 sessions, 100 individual meetings, 170 amendments fought over. And she brings it to the floor, and the General Assembly passes it. And when the General Assembly passes it, the chairperson of the General Assembly calls out Eleanor Roosevelt as the person who made this possible. And for the first time in the history of the United Nations, because at that point she's just a delegate, for the first time in the history of the United Nations, the entire General Assembly stands up and gives one of their delegates a standing ovation. And so this becomes now the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, setting a marker of what we as a world aspire to. And I say aspire because it doesn't become law, but it gets translated into 524 languages. It is the most translated document in the history of the world. And it is what we like to think that we're aspiring to. And I spoke earlier to this notion of getting away from victor's justice. As the United Nations evolves, as we as a world evolve, we in fact set up tribunals based on these universal declarations to try to hold some people accountable, leaders for their actions in the world. The first international court that was created in that regard was a standalone international tribunal to look at what had happened in the former Yugoslav Republic. And Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic were held responsible for the slaughtering of thousands and thousands of civilians, Muslim civilians in Bosnia. In Rwanda, that became the second independent, standalone international tribunal to try to bring people responsible for the horrible slaughter and genocide in Rwanda. And this man here, Jean-Paul Akayesu, was the first person held responsible, the first of many that this tribunal held responsible for the slaughter in Rwanda. And then we created the United Nations, we created a new permanent international criminal court. And the first person to be brought to justice in this now permanent standing criminal court is this man here, Thomas Gilo, from the Congo. And he was brought to justice for essentially kidnapping and impressing all these young boys, almost all boys, there probably were some young girls, 10, 11-year-old boys into becoming his soldiers. And he was brought to justice. And for a long time, although the United States did not join this court, we've never given up our sovereignty to be subjected to it. We have supported it. And then, in the Trump administration, under President Trump and Attorney General Bill Barr, we made a 180-degree turn. because the International Criminal Court felt empowered to look at civilian deaths in Afghanistan and possible malfeasance by United States and soldiers and CIA operators, as well as the Taliban, for the death of civilians in Afghanistan. And under Trump and Barr, they set forth sanctions against the judges of the court and have actually set out arrest warrants. So if any of the judges of the International Criminal Court were to come to the United States, they could be subject to arrest because of our complete unwillingness to be held accountable by this tribunal. So there's some question what will happen when Joe Biden takes over as president, as he will on January 20th, despite President Trump's best wishes. Where will we go? Will we, there's no way I would ever expect us to go to the Senate, that he would go to the Senate and say, we will become a signatory and subject our people to his jurisdiction. But I would not be surprised if he withdraws the sanctions and the arrest warrants, and we again become a tacit member of the world community when it comes to human rights. But it all started with Eleanor Roosevelt and her passion and her drive and this shy young girl who becomes truly, if not the first citizen of the world, truly one of its greatest. And so thanks for sticking with me today as we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And 2 days from now, we can all celebrate International Human Rights Day. Thank you very much.